Welcome everybody here. I'm here with ter Maat for president. We're going to be doing an interview focusing on economic and some obvious questions such as immigrations and world politics.
Sounds terrific. Thanks for having me on. It's terrific to be with you.
So I think we should just jump right into it and ask about some of the biggest issues of the day. I think one that a lot of people are really focused on right now is inflation and the economy in general. So what would you do as president to help walk back the inflation that we're experiencing?
Inflation in particular, I think there's a couple of different things that you've got to jump on as quick and as hard as possible, although they each have long-term pathways to success. One is you've got to get the Federal Reserve on a better footing as far as how they determine monetary policy. I'm not a fan of the discretionary nature of Fed policy. I would replace their leadership as quickly as possible with economists who believe in a rules-based system. The long-term objective has got to be to replace the Federal Reserve completely with a rules-based system, to make their regulatory structure completely optional for financial institutions, take away their balance sheet, put it under the auspices of the Treasury Department, and subject to legislation to stop the bailouts, as well as one of the things that you might want to talk about at some point is we need to make sure that the Federal Reserve System does not begin issuing central bank digital currency, which a lot of organizations around the world are working on as well, not just the Fed. So for all these reasons, we want to sunset the Fed as quickly as possible. But I do believe the first step in doing that is replacing the leadership with economists who believe in a rules-based system. We can all argue about what the appropriate rule should be, but my favorite is the Milton Friedman idea of controlling with a fixed growth rate the money supply and not letting it waver from a committed annual growth rate. It is a secondary matter what that growth rate is, as long as it's published, committed, everyone knows what it is, and everyone understands it's not going to change. I would pick something like 2 or 3% to mirror the typical growth rate of the economy, to try to minimize the extent to which we have deflation or inflation. But to the extent to which we do have any, investors would know that it were the result of changes in the business cycle instead of the effects we have today, where investors are always trying to guess are the results of inflation or deflation, of course, mostly inflation, whether that's the result of changes in Fed policy or something going on in the business cycle, which is a real problem. And in this sense, we would nip inflation in the bud as well, which of course is a horrendous long-term policy that the Fed has engaged in. And I would hasten to add, Joshua, that the Fed is, an organization of very hardworking, very smart, and I believe well-intentioned people. But they have demonstrated as an organization that it is utterly incapable of living up to the mandate that we have given it in terms of leaning against the business cycle, damping out the fluctuations, the boom-bust cycle. In fact, I think a lot of economists have finally come to the understanding and the at least tacit agreement that the Fed in many cases makes it worse. The other thing that you asked about inflation generally, not just Fed policy. The other thing...
And your point about intentions, I would say that the road to hell is paved with those good intentions.
I would agree with you, and I would go one step further and say that a lot of that asphalt has been put down by the Federal Reserve System.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
The other thing that you've got to do is get federal expenditures under control, the expenditures of the U.S. federal government. There is an argument to be made for a balanced budget and a balanced budget amendment, and I appreciate that. However, as we all know, you can achieve balancing the budget through increasing taxation, and that's as anti-growth as any policy. So what I would institute is a cap on federal expenditure. I do believe that federal expenditures is the root of much evil.
That's an interesting thought, because if it's a cap on federal expenditures, they would have an incentive to fight inflation because if inflation goes up and their cap doesn't, their ability to spend is going down.
Well, that's exactly right. And it's interesting you put your finger on that so quickly. You're way out ahead of me. And if you were to cap expenditure, you get out of this idea that you can get around it through taxation. Debt itself no longer becomes a viable strategy for expanding the size of the government. And of course, a lot of the issuance of debt turns into an incentive, and certainly, if nothing else, a strong vehicle for the Fed to monetize and create inflation through their discretionary policy. So for all these reasons, I would cap spending. And by the way, the other reason we want to cap spending is because it's the size and scope of the government itself that's a problem, not just for inflationary purposes, which is horrendous and hellacious, but in terms of getting the government off of our back and out of our lives. I think that one vehicle for doing that is to cap expenditure.
I completely agree with that. But the one thing I'm curious about is if you actually think a governmental organization would have any additional accountability than what the Fed currently experiences.
It is difficult to bring the Fed under control, which is why I would start out with replacing the leadership. In my experience, and I believe in the experience of most anyone who has spent as many unfortunate years as I had in Washington, it's very difficult to sunset even a function of the government, much less an entire agency. And the first step to that is making it as irrelevant and as politically unpowerful, as politically weak as possible. And that begins, in the case of the Federal Reserve System, that's got to begin with taking away its discretionary monetary policy, or at the very least, replacing leadership that wants to do so. So I do think it's an unfortunate multi-step process, but that's what you have to begin with. Once you take away their monetary discretion, then I think that you can move legislation more effectively to get under control their balance sheet and their regulatory structure. But I think it's got to begin with getting that discretionary monetary policy under control.
Mm-hmm. So basically neuter them first and then move on to everything else.
I believe that is correct. As you're well aware, the Federal Reserve System is an enormously politically powerful organization. It is its own power base in D.C. for a variety of reasons, not the least of which, of course, is its ability to expand its balance sheet. And for this reason, politicians... infinitely. And for this reason, politicians just love it to death. There is also a mystique about the Fed, which I believe is earned in terms of hard work, but not earned in terms of success. And so we need to work on winnowing that down as well.
Well, as we all know, the value of what you produce does nothing to do with the labor, but everything about the actual value of what you produce.
I have the non-growing trees in my backyard to prove it. I've worked very hard at digging those holes and planting things, and they don't always work out.
Exactly. Right now, Fed is digging ditches that we're hopefully not going to put people in.
Hopefully, all too many
lives.
Well, you're right. All too many lives have been undermined in terms of wealth creation and wages by inflation, and so it's a real shame.
Yeah, I was actually referencing the analogy that in communism they consider you have full employment if you send all your people out to dig ditches that are completely useless. But at the same time, under communism, you dig ditches and then you fill them with...
Well, you're exactly right. And as much as I might want to convince my wife at the end of the week, I was fully employed digging those holes for the trees, you can still look out the window and see that some of those aren't growing. And you can fool, only everybody once in a while, but you can't fool all the people all the time.
Well, there's the advantage of the subjective value, because if you're out there digging ditches, well, at least for someone like me, I'm working off a lot of calories doing that.
Well, that's
true. Are you there?
there is some value there, and there are probably ways for us to get exercise and not be as unproductive as I am as a gardener.
I hear you there. I was actually at the homesteading convention this weekend. There was a lot of people who know how to be a lot more productive in the garden than I am.
Well, I can imagine. I've never been to that meeting, but I understand it's I understand there's a wide variety of people there, including, I'm told, any number of libertarians.
Oh, huge number of libertarians there. I mean, I felt like I was at a libertarian convention.
That's fantastic.
It was an amazing experience. It was probably 4 or 5 times as many people as they expected to have. They expected to grow by 50% next year. It was very exciting, very encouraging, very invigorating experience.
Well, thanks for the heads up. I'm going to try not to miss it next time.
Yeah. And there are a lot of influencers that did some great talks on a lot of subjects. Everything from how to butcher a pig to till a field.
Wow. Well, I need to learn how to till a field, but I do think I'd probably I couldn't be any worse at cleaning a pig. So
I will admit that one was a little bit intense.
I bet that was extremely intense.
Well, I was a few hundred feet away because I couldn't get close to the demonstration. But it was very interesting. Most of the time, I was at our own booth for the company I work for.
Yeah, that is true.
This actually agriculture leads into the other question that I have, which is almost very obvious, immigration. So in a world where we have so many government assistance programs and money we're throwing at all of these immigrants, how do you hold a libertarian immigration policy in a world where there are entitlements?
Well, there's a lot there. Let's see if we can unpack it piece by piece. I'll work in your direction. I'll start where you left off, which is with entitlement policy. First of all, obviously, we need to get our entitlement policy under control in a much broader context than merely immigration, for a variety of reasons. One of which is the fiscal expenditure crisis that we're in right now. One is, and I might argue that this is of similar importance. I believe that many of our entitlement programs actually undermine our culture. And for this reason, I think that we need to get it under control as well. Social Security, for example, I think is, I don't like to throw around the word evil too easily, but I've got a real ethical problem with herding young people into a Social Security system that virtually guarantees that you're going to have a crappy rate of return, if you have any positive rate of return at all. I also have a problem calling it a rate of return, making it sound like it's an investment program, which of course you and your listeners know that it damn well is not.
And it is not voluntary, is an investment.
That's true. And nor are you investing in any sense in a type of asset. All you're really doing is engaging in their transfer program. And I've got a problem with putting young people into the system really for the express purpose of resolving the fiscal hole in the program in order to take care of our demographic problem. But having said all of that, you do have to make sure, to the extent to which you can't resolve your entitlement system quickly, you do have to make sure that immigrants do not avail themselves and therefore create an incentive for extra immigration in the entitlement programs. And this is done in many cases. Data have shown that immigrants don't participate as fully in many entitlement programs as people born in the United States. But having said that, you need to make sure that you're not creating an incentive to come in the United States just for entitlement programs. Having said that, oh, and by the way, I have also seen data that suggests that immigrants commit fewer crimes than people born in the United States per head. But having said all of that, I do believe that the United States would benefit from a more pro-immigrant and a more pro-immigration policy, not because of favorable crime rates or even because of favorable entitlement participation rates, but because I do believe that immigration is good for our economy. I believe it's good for our demographic situation. And I also believe it's good for the United States culturally. It's one of those things that, in my view, has defined the United States culturally over the years and keeps it sort of as vibrant and as new, continuously new and refreshed as it has been. Having said all of that, it is, and thank you for being so patient while I try to peel this onion. It is true that politically speaking, and not irrationally, Americans have concerns about being able to control the border. Now, I may not share all of those concerns, right? But I'm not going to be able to convince the population in a hurry that you have nothing to worry about, we're going to throw open the border. That is not a politically viable situation.
I think what they're most concerned about is the fact that a lot of the immigrants, the illegal immigrants, have different rules when it comes to employment taxes, minimum wage, etc. So by engaging in this black market of labor, they are making it harder for people to participate legally in the economy. Plus, if it's black market labor, they are paying taxes into the system that they are getting social services from. And I think many of my listeners believe that you cannot allow this sort of immigration until those problems are fixed first.
Agreed. We've got we've got more than one black market in the context of immigration, so this is going to take a few minutes to peel this onion, but you're absolutely right. I would not tell people that are coming to the United States that they cannot work legally. I would tell them that you damn well better work. I think a better policy than the one we have now is to call them in 2 weeks and say, did you get a job? What I was about to mention is that 100 million years ago, when I worked for the White House, we could vet people in to the White House complex, the 3 or 4 building complex, in an hour and a half from a cold start. And I realize there's a little bit of apples to oranges comparison here, but you see where I'm going. I don't think it's reasonable to say we need years to vet people to come into the United States. I think the default ought to be that if we can't figure out a reason to keep you out, we have reason to bring you in. I believe that we should put people in a position to work. I also believe that you are exactly right about the black market in labor undermining the labor markets as we know them and as we want them to work. We also have a huge black market problem which affects labor, but is an even broader concern in the sense that we have people coming across the border illegally who are being manipulated and taken advantage of by what we call coyotes on the other side and then human traffickers on this side. And it's a it's a hellacious situation. By the way, shame on me for not appreciating just how massive it is until I spent a couple of days down there last fall. I talked to CBP experts and local sheriff's office and some ranchers that own property on the border. And it really impressed me that that is a problem of a magnitude that rivals the overall, the rest of the immigration problem. In other words, you've got a black market problem in labor, you got a black market problem in human trafficking, you've got an assimilation sort of rate problem, you've got a control the border problem. But I believe that a lot of solution has to begin with getting our border under control, not because we don't want people to come in, but because we don't want them taken advantage of by human traffickers. This also means we need to do a much, much better job of vetting them in a timely fashion.
Yes.
Black markets are created when you try to shut something down that you can't shut down completely for whatever, the culture is not ready to give it up, right? This is what we see in the war on drugs is, you're trying to affect culture backwards by leading with public policy instead of recognizing that public policy and especially criminalization needs to be downstream. In the case of criminalization, far downstream from culture.
Same with prohibition. And if they decided to try to ban guns.
Well, you're exactly right. I shudder to think what would happen if somebody tried to ban guns in a particular area. We already have a problem in Washington, D.C. in this regard, which is one of the most violent places in the world now. So having
everywhere in the United States where they put more restrictive gun laws in place, we see more gun crime.
That has been the case. And I believe that time will tell that those things are causally linked. I don't think that we can prove that yet, but I think that you and I are both suspicious that there's a causal relationship there.
Extremely strong causal relationship.
Yeah. And so I think that we need to, as much as I hate, and I believe you do too, the idea of extra federal resources being used for damn near anything, I would reallocate resources probably from the Defense Department to our border to shut down human trafficking and to vet people across the border legally in a much more rapid fashion. And I think that, to your point about labor markets, we need to change what the laws say about your right to work once you're in the United States.
Absolutely. You may not know this, but my wife is actually an immigrant. And one of the most difficult things we experienced was the hoops they made you jump through that did the United States absolutely no benefit, stopped no people from getting in that we wouldn't want to get in. All they accomplished was just to make it more expensive, take longer, and be more of a headache. And if their goal is to push people to say, how dedicated are you to become an American citizen? Sure, they accomplished that goal, but anybody who starts that process has already demonstrated the same amount of dedication, because it's hard to start.
It is very hard to start, and it's extremely discouraging. And these are the type of people that you want to have as citizens, right? People who frankly,
legally.
Well, that's right.
Who are willing to play by the same rules as other Americans.
Agreed, 100%.
We need to walk all those rules back, but we need to see that they're willing to play by those rules.
That's right. And we need to make the rules viable, to your point about your wife. We need to make it viable for them to get vetted through, to get work legally, to participate in this system completely, including paying taxes. Taxes are one of those things that we wish didn't exist, but to the extent to which other Americans are paying them, we certainly don't want to create a class that people resent because they're forced to be exempt.
Right. I want to walk back to one of your previous points that you made a second ago about people being able to work when they come into the United States. I know that my wife had a real hard problem with the fact that she wasn't able to work right away. And I know a lot of refugees from like Ukraine and such, they need work in order to be able to live their lives and even be able to get an apartment and get their kids educated and fed.
Yeah.
And the government is saying, no, you can't work.
It's insane.
Live. It's like, well, why did you let them in if you're not going to let them support themselves?
I think it's completely backward. I mean, why would you want to contribute to the development of a culture that says people shouldn't work? I mean, it just strikes me as completely backward. Like I say, I think a better policy would be call them in 2 weeks and make sure they're working.
Exactly. Like all of this welfare, paying people not to work.
No, it's insane. It reminds me of paying farmers not to produce.
Exactly. Why don't you just pay farmers to have more organic or something like that with the same money? I'm against the government paying money for anything like that. But I'm saying that in terms of net benefit to society, pay them to make it more of a clean production.
Of course. There are many ways of doing it less stupid than we do now. If they would get out of interventionism and protectionism, we would have a better system. But that's a whole political hornet's nest that we have to take on. And I do believe
the goal is not to make anything better. The goal is to make it so the government is necessary.
You nailed it. And this is what creates, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, about the difficulty of sunsetting programs. Once they are politically powerful because people want them so much, it's hard to get rid of them. So you need to winnow them down politically before you can move legislation to sunset them completely.
Which actually ties into my next question, which is probably the most firecracker of all of them. How, in a libertarian mindset, do you deal with countries who invade smaller countries and want to conquer the world like Russia and China?
I have been accused of saying things that make this sound easy. So I want to start out by saying, to the extent to which I say this, I have misspoken.
I'll preface this by saying my in-laws are all Russian, and I have a lot of experience on the Russian side of this question.
Well, I believe that you do, and I'm not going to try to rival or challenge your Russian expertise. I think that a number of things can be true at the same time. And maybe we should, can we start out talking about Ukraine as a specific example before we go broader?
It might be useful, but because there are intricacies involved,
It makes it
it makes,
difficult.
exactly, it makes it less, how shall I say it?
Broadly
It
applicable
address the
principles.
theoretical issues in a less direct manner, but it's more likely for people to get their blood up.
Well, you're right about that. There's a couple of things that I think the United States gets wrong frequently. So let's start big picture instead. One is that we do not recognize that we stink at strategic military intervention. By that, I mean, we're very good at a number of tactical things, right? We're good at moving people and equipment. We're good at taking and holding land. We're good at opening and protecting sea lanes. We're even good at toppling governments, if you don't mind the secrets coming out eventually. There are a number of tactical things that we're very good at, and I don't want to say cost effectively, but given the amount of money that our Defense Department is willing to spend, we are able to accomplish certain things at a tactical level. But I don't think it's any longer true that the United States population as a whole would point at recent examples of our military interventionist foreign policy and say that's an example that was a good idea. Notwithstanding the billions and the lives lost by the thousands, and in the example of Iraq and Afghanistan, literally trillions that were spent in dollars, and literally, including foreign nationals, of course, several hundreds of thousands of lives lost. I don't think that people would, in the United States, most American citizens would point at these examples and say that was a good idea, notwithstanding all of that. Even the smaller examples, I don't think that people would agree it's worth it. And for this reason, I think there's an opportunity there for example, the Libertarian Party to make its point, because I think that a lot of the population is ready to hear a more robust anti-war message than they've been hearing for a long, long, long time. But having said that, as a matter of principle, there is a practical aspect to this principle, which is you've got to come to some sort of reality. And that reality is that we are not good at this at a strategic level. Going up a notch in terms of principle, I think that you would have to argue neither is anyone else very good at this. And even if we were, we don't have the moral authority, nor does anyone else, to tell anybody else what kind of government you should be supporting and running. And I mentioned that, which is not exactly what you brought up. You brought up another country overrunning a country, right?
Correct.
And that's a different question, I grant you. But a lot of American foreign policy has revolved around we're unhappy with a particular government in a particular place, and so we're either going to explicitly and directly try to undermine that government or even overthrow that government from time to time, or at the very least, for example, in the case of China, we're going to try to hem them in, right? Or in the case of the Soviet Union, we're going to try to threaten them until they drive up their expenditures to a point where they can't afford to run their government anymore, and we're going to call that in some sense a victory. And I think it's important to start there, at least this is how I frame up much of this question. It's important to recognize that the United States foreign policy does revolve around, to a certain extent, to a large extent, this idea that we believe we're smarter than everybody else and that everyone else would benefit from democracy, that we understand how democracy does and should work, and therefore not only do we understand how to feed it to you, but we understand that it's in your interest if we do so, even if it's forcibly. And I think that when you start with that frame of reference, it's illustrative, but you kind of get where I'm going. We need to get the United States off of this mindset, because I believe that it is that drives our willingness to say, in addition to all of that, we're not going to allow, let's use the word war, right? We're not going to allow attacks from one country on another, because it's in our long-term interest to maintain stability until it's not, until we define, the kind of stability that we want as meaning stability for us, but your government, we prefer to be unstable and it's time to replace you. And I think that
Yeah.
that's a lot of what's going on in Ukraine, for example. And I am not someone who likes to apologize for Vladimir Putin or the Russian government. I personally think that the Russian government is one of the few on the planet that makes Washington, D.C. look really smart. But having said that, I think it is incorrect to say that the United States has a sufficiently robust long-term interest in Ukraine that it would be worth it to engage in either side of this war. And I truly believe that the only reason we're in it is because we've been fixing for a proxy war with the Russian army for a long time, and now we've finally found an opportunity.
So if we had no interest in Ukraine, because a libertarian would take the stance that there is no such thing as one nation having an interest in another nation. It's all about internal policy. So if we had no interest in Ukraine, it is simply a country that another country has invaded because they believe they have a right to rule that region. What do you think we should do about it?
I believe that we shouldn't do anything about it.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is I don't believe that we should be intervening militarily. I don't believe that we should be subsidizing one side or the other.
Okay.
I do
see a difference between what we did during World War II and what we're doing now. Because in World War II, we saw the Lend-Lease Act and we also saw military intervention. What we're seeing now is neither of those. What it is the Lend-Lease Act with giant checks.
Giant checks.
And I think that's a huge difference people need to keep in mind.
It's sort of a grant lease act.
Right. It's a different thing to give somebody anti-aircraft guns and tanks to defend their borders and to give them checks that they can money launder.
Well, I think that there is a difference. I think it needs to be said that I wouldn't have a problem with Ukraine acquiring, paying for American citizens produced armaments.
Correct.
I'm not
it would actually be anti-libertarian
try to shut that down.
Sell them.
Pardon me?
I think it would be anti-libertarian to say that we couldn't sell weapons to Ukraine.
That's right.
For them to use in defense.
I agree wholeheartedly, but that doesn't mean that we need to subsidize them. Look, I think that you could probably make an argument today that we're not only in a proxy war with Russia, but we're in just a plain war with Russia. You know, when, and I don't want to exaggerate and make this overly dramatic, but
during the call, I'd like to ask a question using a historical context. During the Vietnam War, the Russians actually took this exact action further because you had Russian fighter pilots flying over Vietnam and fighting American fighter pilots.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I would say, because we never considered ourselves at war with Russia. We considered ourselves at war with Vietnam, and it was still a Cold War with Russia. It still boggles my mind that we never ended up at war with Russia when we were shooting down Russian fighters and they were shooting down ours.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, I think the biggest distinction between the two situations is the management of the propaganda. I don't think the White House wants to admit that we're at war. But when the president, and I'm not arguing that it is not a proxy war, I'm just saying it's on the war side of proxy war, not the proxy side of proxy war. When the president...
It's hotter than normal.
It's a little hotter than normal when you're doing a couple of things. One is, to your point, sending resources as well as subsidizing other resources. We have troops over there. We've only lost a couple of lives, and they are not engaged at the front line, I understand. But there are over 1,000 Defense Department. I'm sure they're mostly contractors, right? As though that matters.
Mercenaries that the government pays for are the same thing as troops.
Of course they are. The President of the United States himself has been over there. I've got a problem with that because now you're in a situation where the propaganda is so strong that it makes it difficult to walk back. I mean, that's really getting toward a commitment when the Commander-in-Chief of the United States is on the ground in Ukraine. The other thing that I look at as a point of reference is that we're now producing material for the war. This isn't just, old Jeeps behind the barracks that nobody was doing anything with. Not that that would be okay either, but it is instructive, I believe, to look at how it is that we're providing resources. When you're producing resources specifically for this war, it starts to feel like a war. The other thing that I think that needs to be said, and I really want your reaction to this, not only because I respect your philosophy, but I know you have a lot of deep background in Russia. It seems to me that if we've learned anything in this war between Russia and Ukraine, it is that the Russian army that Europe has feared tremendously because of a bad attitude and because of a size has proven to be less effective than we had feared. And to the extent to which you might have been able to say NATO was justified because, we're all fearful of the Russian army, that argument has gone away. I believe that it is time for the United States to say NATO is no longer in our interest. Parenthetically, I think that you can argue it hasn't been in our interest since a few hours after we signed it. That's a different issue. To the extent to which you, Mr. or Madam European leader, believe it remains in your interest to be fearful of the Russian army, you do you. But your expenditures on your defense are going to have to reflect that, because the United States forward deployment of troops is no longer going to be your plan A.
From the perspective that the United States has been the shield of Europe against Russia because of the existence of NATO, I would agree with that in principle. I would also say what NATO is now is not what NATO was during the Cold War. So I could see how some people could validate the existence of NATO during the Cold War and not after the Cold War. But at the same time, Russia is behaving exactly as expected during any major war. Russians have always lost heavily at the beginning of any major conflict. In no conflict, unless they dramatically outclass the other opponent, I'm talking about orders of magnitude greater than the Ukraine situation, has Russia not lost massively at the beginning of the war. They always fall back on massive human wave tactics. That is how they've always won. That's how they've always fought. And so the fact that Russia is underperforming at the beginning does not mean they're a threat. In fact, the fact that they pulled themselves out of the retreat so quickly and were able to hold their lines and actually hold territory that they took, that to me says they are a bigger threat than I originally thought.
That's a really interesting perspective. Do you still feel that way, notwithstanding the observation that Ukraine was not a major power and is not a powerful army compared to what other European nations in the Northwest would be able to muster if they really felt like the Russians were threatening to invade? In other words, I think everything you said is exactly on point.
I think you're underestimating the Ukrainian military before the war.
Well, that may be. But my point is that I'm sorry, go ahead.
They had been trained and armed by the West and the United States for almost a decade before the Russians invaded. They were ready for this. They were expecting it. And whenever you're attacking a defender that's expecting it, you have to go in.
It's an uphill battle.
At least 4 to 10 times, not just the manpower, but in terms of artillery and tanks, etc., and logistics. And the only reason that the Russians didn't steamroll them in the beginning is because they are a rail-based logistics system and had their butts handed to them by drone strikes on their logistics train. If that giant convoy had actually made it to Kiev, they would have just taken it. The war would have been over. So I think that the Russian army did not underperform. I think they performed pretty much as expected.
But the Ukraine army performed well, is your point, I think.
Correct, because they were not the same Ukrainian army that the Russians had took Crimea from.
Agreed. And in those years were so important and so formative for the Ukrainian defense. Nonetheless, I can't help getting the feeling that the Europeans should be able to learn enough from this experience to be able to say we should be able to pursue our own defense posture without the United States.
Correct. They cannot hide behind us anymore. They should
Right.
never have been able to hide behind us. If they
I
were
don't even
scared
think
of
it
Russia,
served them well in the long run.
no, it's never serves you well to rely on someone bigger for protection.
Right.
You need to be able to put up your fists and defend yourself.
Absolutely. And
And
that is
they were able-
that is well said.
I think what is incredibly toxic for European culture is they were able to take all the money they didn't have to spend on defense and spend it on idiotic social programs that corrupted their society from within. So the fact that they relied on us to protect them from what they feared allowed them to become the worst version of themselves.
I think you're right about that. And I'm not giving you an argument. I agree wholeheartedly. But we have to recognize the counterpoint is the United States that seems to have wasted money on both, proving that there's not necessarily a robust trade-off at hand. You can't.
It's not either or. We can do both. we can ruin ourselves on the inside while ruining you at
And the outside.
That's because spending is just like a drug addict, rots you from the inside and out.
That's right. It helps you make bad decisions with regard to your habit and bad decisions with regard to the rest of your life. And I think that there is an analogy there to political will in the United States. It's a real shame. But for all these reasons,
like alcoholism.
yeah, for all these reasons, I think that there is an opportunity for libertarians to play a more important role in American politics going forward. I think that there's a recognition from many, many Americans, we're going to find out how many, from many Americans, that a lot of our problems are the result of bad public policy, and that it is not a coincidence that we have crappy leadership in the Republican Party, crappy leadership in the Democratic Party, that those parties have left behind any semblance of what they used to argue was their policy agenda. Now their number one goals on either side is keeping the other side out of power. We know that that is the root in a democracy of where authoritarianism comes from. And I believe that libertarians not only have an opportunity, but I would go so far as to argue an obligation to help America fight its way back toward the Constitution, because I don't think anyone else is going to do it. I just don't think that lowercase l or capital L. I don't think a traditional Republican, I certainly don't think a Donald Trump, for example, is going to help in that regard. I don't think a Biden administration is going to help in this regard. I think something very strange is going to happen in 2024, Josh. Either a very old man is going to be reelected president of the United States, who is a guy that we have recognized for generations to be not all that smart when he was as smart as he could be, or Donald Trump is going to be reelected after not only a few indictments that we could all argue are politically motivated, but after an indictment for, I'm sorry, not an indictment, but a civil court finding that he was responsible for a sexual assault that, I got to be honest with you, actually bothers me more than the silly indictment stuff. I think it would be very strange in the grand span of American history for that guy to be reelected. I thought it was strange he was elected in the first place. One of those two strange things is going to happen, or I am going to be elected. And I'll hand you that is a strange possibility also, but something strange is, something strange is going to happen.
So in that vein of authoritarianism, do you find it more upsetting that Donald Trump is experiencing these relentless prosecutions and indictments, or more upsetting that Hillary and Biden and their party have been exempt from exactly the same sort of indictments?
That is a tough competition. You have set up two titans of things to be pissed off about. I'm gonna go with, it bothers me more that Trump is being politically chased. And it's not because I've got any patience for him in particular. I was in New York in the 80s. I've got a long history of reasons to observe and take note of him with a certain amount of disdain. I'm no fan of Donald Trump. He's a populist. He's not a libertarian. Say that again, I'm sorry?
Oh, me neither.
Yeah, well, yeah. And that ought to be a bigger club than it is. So I would hate to accidentally say something in his defense that sounded like it was personal. It's not. I think the guy is a jerk, and if he ever did go to jail, I might think that it was overly politically motivated, but on a personal level, it's not like I'm going to, stay awake at night, right? But this idea of pursuing past leaders with these, by the way, obviously politically motivated attacks, objectively speaking, I mean, when you've got a prosecutor saying, I'm going to go after Trump, and then does so, I don't know how to interpret that otherwise, right?
Well, it creates an incentive to not leave office and to retain power, even if it's violently, because you know the people coming after you are going to make something up and come after you and throw you in jail. It's the same problem that creates the issue when it comes to welfare. We've created incentive not to work for the farmers, incentives not to plant. And
These are
people coming over the border, incentives to not do it legally. It's all about the incentives that we create in our civilization.
Well, you're exactly right. If you're in Donald Trump's head this year, you've got to be saying, not only was I right to do whatever I could legally or otherwise to stay in power, but I probably should have done twice as much because this sucks, right?
Yeah.
You see your point. And these are lessons that we should be able to learn from.
He also should have learned how to hold his tongue.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to say that the guy has some things to learn that's a long list. That's a separate podcast.
Yeah.
So yeah, he did and does and will do a lot of things wrong in the future. And by the way, none of that is to say that I don't think that he broke the law, because in many of these cases he did. It's hard for me to get all torn up inside about the mismanagement of documents, for example.
Right. And it's also something that all the other presidents did.
Of
and when
course
you have a law that is not enforced, and then suddenly when it meets your political ends, it becomes a law that is enforced, I think that invalidates the law itself.
Well, agreed. It certainly invalidates any of our faith as citizens that we have in the system, right? Which has got to be the bedrock of any criminalization, to the point that we were discussing earlier. When you criminalize something, it better damn well be far downstream of a cultural consensus that you want that to be illegal, you want it to be prosecuted, and the potential, we all support the potential of someone being punished for it. And if you don't have that, then you shouldn't be criminalizing something. And that's, I think, where we are with this document silliness. So, yeah, that's a problem. And none of that is to say that, the other choice you put up, right, that the earlier violators of some of these rules and laws, they should have been prosecuted as well. Well, that's probably true if you're going to have that system. I mean, if you're really going to commit to this is something that we want to criminalize, I think that we need to take a hard look at the extent to which we criminalize the mismanagement of documents. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I went with choice B. It bothers me more, the politically motivated prosecution of Donald Trump.
Right. I think what upsets me and a lot of my listeners is the fact that there are rules for thee, but not for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a hard one to bite off when Hillary Clinton arguably did worse things with full knowledge that she is doing them in order to escape prosecution.
I don't think it's arguable that it's worse, because there's clear evidence that other countries had access to her server.
Well, that's right.
It's almost impossible. It's almost impossible for anybody to have access for the random documents in Trump's office. So I would say that the effects of foreign espionage, which is the whole point of the law,
right,
took effect on Hillary, but not on Trump.
You're exactly
Trump was
right.
prosecuted and Hillary wasn't.
You're exactly right. And like I say, the intentional aspect of it bothers me as well. So whether you look at it from the left or from the right, she should have been prosecuted if Donald Trump is going to be prosecuted. And that was our understanding of the law at the time. And she wasn't, there were other Army officers, for example, who were prosecuted for the same thing. I think it's a real shame that she wasn't when they were.
Exactly. She's an elite class. She gets treated differently. She can break the law with impunity. And now that is extended to President Biden and someone who's not even part of his administration. What do you think of the cocaine? I mean, I know libertarians have much softer view about illicit substances, but what do you think about Hunter bringing the cocaine into the White House.
I think the problem isn't the cocaine itself. I think to your point, right? It's not the cocaine that bothers me so much. One of the things that bothered me about it was that it was found in a working area in the West Wing. How do I put this politely? I don't think that Hunter Biden should be anywhere near the West Wing of the White House. And I recognize that Jill probably doesn't want him in the East Wing either. But, you know, if these were breadcrumbs that we found in the West Wing, and it was the type of bread that only Hunter eats, I think I would be just as concerned. It's not the cocaine. It's the demonstration that that's where he was, that he's doing things that his father agrees are illegal, but he does them anyway. And I wonder what kind of weird relationship is going on there. None of my business, right? Until it becomes a matter of public policy. And I wonder about...
I think it is a matter of public policy. I think he is influencing public policy. But going back to the previous point, if any of Donald Trump's children had cocaine in the White House...
Paul, can you imagine?
I guarantee you they'd be prosecuted.
Of course they would be. And if there were financial kickbacks coming back from foreign governments, albeit through 3 layers of shell corporations, of course anyone else would be prosecuted. I do worry that this is something that is getting swept under the rug, the financial kickback potential scandal. A lot of information we don't have yet, so I want to be careful of, not to accuse people of doing something I can't prove, but there's a lot to worry about there.
This is just my random show. You can vote. you can make any sort of assumptions you want. Now,
let's just leave it at I'm very worried. I'm very, very worried. And because of the nature of their relationship, because there's no accountability, and because having observed Joe Biden over a long, long time, this is a guy who operates outside of an envelope of principles or accountability anyway. And so for all these reasons, I worry about him being not only the kind of guy who might think it's okay to take money, but as we've been discussing, there's a difference between the effects of how it happens over here versus the effects of how it happens over here. He's also the kind of guy, not completely coincidentally, who could be affected by that. In other words, I don't want to name names, there are other personalities who you would be very surprised about if someone were to tell you that guy, maybe you hate his guts, maybe you love him, but that guy took money from a foreign government and it affected his decision-making. You'd say, I don't think so. I don't think so. You cannot say that about Joe Biden. If someone told you he could be affected by a foreign government, you might say, well, I didn't expect it, but I can't say I'm shocked.
Well, I think at least half the people who voted for Biden actually believe that he is engaging in things that are completely illegal. The scary part is they think it's okay because he is on their side. They've engaged in this rampant political tribalism.
Yeah. Well, you brought up, that's a whole bailiwick, everything from how we root for legislation, how we root for the White House, taking more power if they're on our side, and perhaps most dangerously of all, this is the lens through which we now view Supreme Court resolutions, cases, decisions, all about whether we're getting the short-run result that we want. So even when the Supreme Court makes decisions that are objectively, technically correct, we're upset because, that wasn't on my side of the argument for how I wanted the argument to come down in terms of what I wanted to be able to do.
Right. It creates incentives, like we were talking about earlier, to take it out on the other party before they can take it out on you. But also you get things like the Patriot Act and the new TikTok ban, which are simply massive power grabs that people on both sides of the aisle are voting for. If anything,
it's insane.
Prove to people that the Republicans are no longer than the Democrats, it's those two.
Yeah. Well, student loans is the most recent example, right? Yeah. Everyone is upset because they wanted their student loans canceled, or they wanted it canceled for other people. I honestly, I don't know how you argue the other side. First of all, I don't know how you argue that the legislature meant to give Joe Biden, any president, the authority to cancel student loans. I don't know how you make that argument. But more importantly, I was very disappointed with the Supreme Court for not striking it down on more fundamental grounds.
Right.
If they had said, by the way, even if the legislature had said, knock yourself out, you can cancel these loans if you want to, that should have been struck down on constitutional grounds.
I completely agree with you. But there's nothing we can do about it because we're not in power right now.
No, we're not in power right now. I do believe that there will come a time when either a capital L or lowercase L libertarian will send us some semblance of power. I'm hopeful that it'll be in the White House in the next 14 years, possibly sooner. It's not impossible that it would be in 2 years, but eventually it's either that or we're in a world of hurt, both in terms of the fiscal solvency of the federal government of the United States, which is probably the least of our problems. You know, Joshua, one of my greatest concerns is that when the United States government, federal government goes bankrupt, people like you and me, we won't even care. We'll be so sick of how the government has come to operate that we'll be like, you know what? Time to hit the reset button anyway.
Well, I think one of the most important things, if that time ever comes, is the order of operations and how things are fixed. Because you can't fix how you let people into the country until you fix what they're given once they're inside the country, like we were talking about earlier.
That's right.
So if we ever do find ourselves in a position to fix things, doing it in a measured, methodical, and organized manner is going to be the most important part.
Well, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I'm not optimistic that the current band in Washington is capable of that, but nice words.
Completely agree. All right, I think that's everything. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover?
I think that we covered a lot of ground. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed being with you. You have a great program, and it's been a wonderful conversation.
Excellent. It was great to have you on here and hope to talk soon.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Joshua.
Bye.